This program is intended for mature audiences only.
You are now listening to Observable Radio.
Hi there, it's Cameron Suey. This month, we're bringing you another older story, a longer tale that's both a love letter to San Francisco and a reason for leaving. Season 2 is still coming later this year. For more information, we're giving monthly updates for free on our Patreon, and we'd love to see you there. And now, after a brief word from the Observable Radio Company store, here's tonight's story.
I lived so long with it, I didn't realize there could be another way, you know? It was just so cold, all the time. I don't remember a time I didn't feel like I was freezing. And it wasn't my hands or my feet or even my head. It was like I couldn't keep my body warm, no matter what I did. And then my doctor told me about shirts.
With a shirt like the Tower Operator shirt at the Observable Radio Company store, you'll never suffer from a regular torso insulation again. Ask your doctor if shirts are right for you. Shirts. Stop being cold. You are now buying from Observable Radio. Mapping the crooked places. When I emerged from a decade beneath the waves of my private sea, my parents were dead and gone. With a clarity I had not experienced since my youth, I drifted like an airborne seed through the city. I fell in love, not with my fellow man, but with the places men gather. With a small fortune, the life insurance and inheritance that churned the modest guilt inside me, I put down gossamer roots into a dozen places across San Francisco, staying only long enough to satisfy my curious new desire for belonging before again taking to the breeze. In every place I settled, I drew a map, dreamed a new metaphor. When I lived in the shadows of the medical college, haunting bars filled with sleep-deprived and wild-eyed doctors-to-be, my map of the city was like the organs and cells in a body, a vascular system of roads, a nervous system of wires, and the pale and textureless connective tissue between. When I left the drafty Coal Valley flat for a studio loft in the Mission, I mapped the city as a battleground, isolated camps of combatants brought together by common ideals, surrounded by the rotting demilitarized zones of cultural vacancy. From a top-floor apartment on Market Street, I saw the city as a vast and productive farm, where I surveyed each field growing signature and heirloom crops to be counted, stored, and sold. Like any farm, there were fallow pieces between the fields, cracked and rotting fences, and rusting, abandoned machinery. In every place I settled, these nameless in-between places, the featureless empty zones between the landmarks and neighborhoods filled me with shivering unease. Like mines without souls, the interstitial burrows seemed on the verge of rotting away beneath my feet. It was many months before I could admit why. They were the places that I had once sought out. Gray places filled with gray faces, where I once found quiet oblivion without judgment. The empty hollows of civilization that I let suck so much of my life away. With the veil now lifted, I did everything I could to avoid them, and their whispering temptations. Inside the vibrant neighborhoods where I now made my homes, I would travel only by foot or bike, for fear that I would wall myself away from the beauty. But when crossing the borderlands, I needed the barriers of taxi cabs and train cars. The empty places reeked of my disease and threatened to make me ill. I passed through them only when need dictated, and my resolve was strongest. When my map of the city and her identities grew dense, I had still not found a place I felt I belonged, a place I would want to truly live in. I imagined, like the newborn that I was, that all the city's secrets were known to me, and my love for her turned sour. I flirted with the idea of starting again, picking another of the world's greatest cities and emerging naked and fresh into yet another new life. In a fugue of self-pity, I forgot why I feared the hinterlands between the hearts, and wandered into their blankness again and again. I found outposts inside these places where people gathered together for heat, for light, for company, defiant against the bleakness that surrounded them. Although I could no more relate to them than I could the denizens of the more desirable neighborhoods. I found comfort in those places. Not the comfort I craved, but the comfort I remembered. It was there that I could crouch on the precipice and peer back down into my old oubliette. An old familiar voice whispered back from the darkness, and I began to think echoes of old thoughts. Perhaps I had ignored these places and much of the city, so much of what truly made it, under false pretenses. I had allowed the weakness of my own character to cloak these misunderstood places in a miasma of fear that stemmed only from my own failings. With renewed desire, I threw myself back into exploration to again be a cartographer, to map the crooked places that had once held me in a different kind of thrall. I could return to the Shadowlands and see them for what they really were, and I could pass through them unharmed and clear of mind and continue my search. This is what I told myself. I even believed it, some of the time. It was on this last leg of my quest that I came upon the tower. It stood alone, in a district that should have curled cold tendrils of unease around my spine. The streets were empty and clean in a way that suggested not constant attention, but disuse, and its only neighbors were warehouses and the pale shadows of failing restaurants and cafes. I had seen its skeleton from a dozen of my nests, for it had been growing all the while, like the twisting branches of a great stone and glass tree for the last half of a decade. It should have filled me with loathing. Artless and empty, a featureless glass monolith designed to house the young and wealthy and those who were drawn to the in-between places for all the wrong reasons. But when I encountered it then, during that final phase of my exploration, something inside it tugged at me, hooked me like a fish and never let go. Something high above the city streets called out to me, singing to me alone. It was an old song sung with a new voice. The sensation was so familiar that I was scarcely aware of the pull. It felt like coming home. Nothing about the tower was beautiful. I see that now. But I had written a check, a deposit for one of the sterile condos above me before I realized that I had walked inside. In that familiar fog of desire, I knew one thing. I needed to be on the upper stories, for the song came from high above me. I convinced the corpulent building manager of my need, and he cracked his wide grin bearing twin rows of perfectly straight teeth and assigned me a unit on the top floor. I rode the elevator in breathless anticipation and went straight to my first room. My belongings and possessions were brought to me later, for once I entered the tower, I only exited it once more, for good, nearly 5 months after. When I left, I was free of the fog, free of my crooked need to find the soul of the soulless places, free of my love of cities and the places of men. I was scoured clean, left raw and naked, every sensation amplified and painful. I left with only my terror and my life, although how much of that I retained is in question. The first apartment's spacious and empty rooms still smelled of construction, dust, and antiseptic cleaners. One glass wall in each room offered a sprawling view of the bay and the crumbling docks, the last few vestiges of proper industry inside the city's borders. I already understood that it was not the view that my sudden hot desire for elevation demanded. It was something else. Within moments, I also understood this. The top floor was too high. Whatever I was drawn to was now beneath me. I left the room and began to descend the stairwell, the metal steps still covered in powdered drywall. I felt the invisible draw in my lungs, the beating of my heart, and the crooked trail of scars on my arms. It took a few floors before the locus of my attraction was level with me, and I entered a hallway that looked identical to the one above. My fingers drifted up to the eastern wall without thought, as so many of my actions had once been, and would become again. I paced the hallway, and I felt a pull down the length of my arm. Like a dowsing rod, I dragged my fingertips across the rough texture. The hissing friction of fingers on plaster and my soft footsteps on the carpet were the only sounds. The air was redolent of paint and carpet glue, but beneath it all, dancing in the air like a cracking whip, was a thin thread of something sickly sweet. A night-blooming flower, a corpse on the border of rot. It was intoxicating. I reached a door halfway down the hall and my legs froze as if rooted to the spot. On the other side of the heavy wooden door, just past my raw fingertips, lay the source of the call. I felt an intense, delicious anticipation, a nearly fulfilled desire, the calm that comes just before the pinprick. No logic could explain nor language could describe what my mind yearned for although the sensations were familiar, the source of the song behind the door was fundamentally alien and 1,000 times stronger. The sweet ache took root in the very structure of my flesh and throbbed with my heart. I raised both hands, fingers splayed wide in a lover's caress, and held my body to the cool wood of the door. I had to enter the room. I needed to be inside. This could only be the home that I had been searching for. I looked up to the numbers, 2319, picked out in delicate and filigreed gold numerals, and committed it to memory, repeating them breathlessly. I knew with a sharp pang that I would need to leave the doorway before I could return to be fulfilled. I would offer any price, I'd pay any cost, but I would cross the threshold. I would go inside, and I would be made happy and whole. I might have stayed fixed to that spot, almost, but not yet touching my prize forever. But after a long moment, through the warped glass bead of the peephole, light flared, shaking me from my trance. It took me a fractured moment to understand. While I pressed my body to the door, sighing with private intimacy, the occupant of 2319, the interloper, had been on the other side, staring out. What kindled in me then was not the polite embarrassment that good breeding and decency demanded, but something more akin to sexual jealousy. But there was more. A violence I felt boiling in my forearms and clenched fists. Something bestial, cruel. Reason returned, and I relaxed, secure in the knowledge that I had the means and now the clarity to take what I needed in the proper way, with no need for bloodshed. I grinned into the looking glass, my eyes slitted with cold assurance. I was not a man accustomed to being disappointed. The manager, that perfect creature of the dead zones, merely furrowed his brows when I returned, holding out my checkbook. The room was indeed taken. It was the first chosen, by the very first occupant. He made clumsy jokes at first, not seeing the clarity of my need. Desire made me needle sharp. I offered to buy out the occupant. I offered to buy the whole building. In the end, the best I could do was place my name first on a waiting list. In the meantime, I moved my deposit to a new room, 2219, where I could wait just below and bide my time until the occupant could be persuaded. I never unpacked. Even though I had the contents of my previous beachside flat shipped to me at great expense, I lived out of boxes, on minimal furniture, and subsisted entirely on delivered food. 2219 was close enough to the wet and living beacon above me to act as a temporary salve, and for a while, I thought it might be enough. Simply being there filled me with a kind of contentedness that I had only dreamt of. My previous life, the wandering cartography of the invisible borders, was over, for I had found what I had been searching for. I would lie on the floor, eyes drifting between the floor-to-ceiling windows, and then to the neutral texture of the roof above, trying to see through. The city beyond held no meaning for me any longer. If I wished, I could still see the neighborhoods and districts I had loved. I could see the gray stripes of nothingness that bound them to each other, the no-man's lands that I had tried to avoid, but I no longer saw. I had misunderstood the city, and now I saw its true meaning. Every part of it, unknown and known, existed across centuries for one purpose: to birth the tower, to create the room above me, to safely house the thing, whatever it was, that sang out in promise to me. I could smell it in my waiting chamber. The strong floral scent permeated the walls and stuck to my skin, cloying and thick. I heard harmonic vibrations echoing through the walls and down the wires and into my veins. My whole life had led to this place and this time, and I hovered on the precipice, terrified to go any closer, for fear of losing it all. But soon, proximity was not enough. I found myself standing on a wooden chair, sometimes for hours on end, trying only to be closer to it. I would stretch my arms high and press my palms to the ceiling, feeling the siren song running through the carpals and radius and ulna and humerus and spreading into my lungs and heart like a warm and familiar wave. But even that could not sate me. So I coiled my desire and need into a sharpened point and brought it into bear against the occupant, the silent intruder above me. I began with noise. I unpacked my stereo and pointed the speakers upward, blasting random and sharp intervals of atonal nonsense. The tower was still sparsely populated, in truth, nearly empty. I knew that I had the floor to myself and but a single neighbor above, yet another sign I disregarded utterly. One in an endless parade that should have driven me far from this place, had I still retained my sanity. But instead, I squatted in that abominable and heartless husk of a home, in a place that should have set my teeth on edge, a wild-eyed and unrepentant fool, a quisling to all that I had claimed to love about the places of men. When the occupant made no complaints, I raised the frequency, the volume, until finally I could no longer stand my own tortures. I turned to pounding on the roof with a broom, slamming the ceiling until chips of paint and plaster fell down into my eyes. More than once, I thought of simply tunneling upwards and emerging from the hole to choke the life out of the occupant and claim my prize. I got a response at last. He would tap his heels, lightly, in echo, and reply to my thundering, a retort I found mocking and intolerable. I tried horrid smells, boiling foul and moldering scraps of food and pouring them on the threshold of 2319 in the small hours of the morning. I made complaints against him, claiming he was responsible for the noises and the smells, but the manager believed none of it, threatened to expel me. I began to slide notes beneath his door, angry volatile screeds, threats, grotesque descriptions of the violence I would visit upon him if he did not vacate the place. They became pleading, mewling cries, offers of wealth, lies, and thin tales designed to stoke his sympathy for my needs. I had made a life once of manipulating people to achieve my desires, and now I used every tool at my disposal. In the end, he would thrust the notes back out as soon as I slid them in. He was always in, always home, and I understood this. He, like myself, and so few others, felt the pull of the place and of whatever was inside. In my most magnanimous and clear-headed days, I knew that he and I were kindred, and he had merely had the luck of being first. I grew thin, physically and mentally, and I became brittle and dry. I was on the verge of giving up, not my desire for the special place above me, but of the very act of living in a final childish tantrum. Although I was closer than I dared dream, the distance felt magnified, and I knew if I left, it would haunt me. A bullet lodged in my flesh, working its way toward my heart for the rest of my days. At last, after a week of petulant fasting, it came to me that there were only a few paths left to lead me to what I needed. I pulled my ragged body, barefoot and reeking, from the sodden chair where I had sat for more than a day. From the kitchen, I retrieved the snub-nosed pistol that I had hoped never to need and left my ersatz apartment. I shuffled on tingling legs toward the stairway and began to climb. I smelled the sweet death smell on the air-conditioned breeze when I entered his hallway, and I pushed my shaking body toward the door. At the precipice, I hesitated and considered moving straight to violence. I could blast the lock from the door, enter with or without permission, and still have enough bullets to clear the occupant from the equation. But I believe we both deserved one final peaceful chance, and so I knocked. And knocked again. And again. After a while, I heard him moving behind the door, a slithering sound like a snake, squatting in the place that should have belonged solely to me. But he would not answer, so I knocked as hard as my condition would allow. I pounded until my knuckles bled. I shrieked, and although the sound from my dry, cracked throat lacked the proper authority, I continued to scream as I hammered the door. At last, I heard the sound of whispers, and the thought of the occupant speaking to it made me nauseous with jealousy. Then I heard him slide towards the door and turn the handle. I wrapped my fingers around the cool assurance of the gun, a totem of my authority, should I need it. The door opened, a fraction of an inch, and the occupant's gleaming eyes met mine. He opened it further, to the full extent the brass chain on the door would allow. I might have kicked against the door, forcing my way inside, but I held fast to some notion that I could still get what I wanted without the undue risk that violence would bring. He was born to be a citizen of the borderlands, like I had become. Plain and well-groomed, he dressed in expensive clothes, worn comfortably like a second skin. Some may have called him handsome, but it was a flavorless sort of pleasantry, symmetrical, synthetic. The imprints of our shared passion clung to him, marked him as a brother and nemesis. He smiled at my wasting body and the stained clothes that clung to my bony frame. But after every glance, I saw his black eyes snap backwards towards the locus of our need. "I understand," he said at last, his eyes still fixed behind him. "I really do." Despite my resolve, I began to cry. Small, exhausted sobs shook my body. If he noticed my shame, he pretended not to, whether in grace or embarrassment, I do not know. "Soon," he said. The word hung in the air and coated me like a healing salve, pregnant with promise. "I'm afraid I'm done with it, or it with me. You'll understand." He shook his head, a singular violent snap, and his face creased. It was a face unaccustomed to sharp emotions, looking oddly fetal and new, as something strong and sharp gripped him. He shuffled ever so slightly backward, his eyes fluttering behind toward the thing I could not see. The knowledge that my desire, my prize, waited for me just beyond his obscuring body clawed at me. My fingers twitched around the weight of the pistol. "It waited so long for this place to be built," he said, patient. "It was here before us, for the city, for anyone, and it will be here long after us." Again, he shuddered, and I saw the suit was soaked with sweat, far filthier than I had originally thought. Not creased, but wrinkled. I had somehow mistaken his tousled appearance for cleanliness, his chaos for order, but the glamour had faded. Beneath the night perfume of our mutual addiction, there was something else, something acrid and wrong. Panic, hysteria, terror, his calm and still demeanor gone. His temporary posture once wielded masterfully, he could no longer hold for more than a minute. This was not my brother, no equal, I thought as I steeled myself for what I had to come. I knew, if I knew anything at all, the sight of a man on a precipice, and I knew how to push. "You're right," I told him, and locked my eyes to his, stretching the last of my strength into a sharpening point. "It's going to kill you. It doesn't want you. It's bored of you." He opened his mouth, let it hang open like a fish. His eyes swam behind a veil of welling tears. "I know." His voice was dry and papery, trash caught in the wind. "But I can't leave. Not yet. What makes you think you'll satisfy it?" "It called to me," I said, stepping closer towards the gap until I could smell his decay. "It called to me, and it has sung to me every night since I came, like it no longer sings to you." I took this shot blind, but I saw in his wincing face that I had struck true. "You might be right," he whispered with a joyless smile. "That I'm here at all should cast out all doubt," I pressed further, putting one hand on the door to push back until the chain vibrated and hummed. "Why are you making this so hard on yourself? It's time to go. It wants me." At that moment, as if to harmonize with my argument, the sweet song behind him surged, hot and fragrant. We turned together, my gazes searching for the wondrous thing that he alone could see. "It's good to be talking with you," he said after a long silence. "You're right. You're right." He grinned wide, and I saw the rot in his teeth. "I needed this to clear my head, I think." The words trailed off, and he turned, rocking on his heels. I threw my weight against the door with a feral scream, but his strength outmatched mine, and the door slammed shut with a click that sounded like the end of the world. But then I heard the shuffle of his feet away from the door, Heard him trying to hold his body aloft before crumpling to the floor. I heard him cry out, a lost wail in the night from the very heart of our desire, and I knew that the gun would not be needed. I had won. At last. I returned to my room below with a lightness in my step that I had not felt since the days below the waves. I went to gather my things and return. The time to submit myself to the thing had come. The muffled sounds of his voice, pleading and ragged, drifted down from above, and I grinned, approaching ecstasy. I heard the sound of something being dragged, and there was a great surge of motion announced in vibrations through the walls. A treble explosion, a splintering symphony of glass. Outside my window, a sparkling cloud of frozen light and an overstuffed leather chair hung illuminated in the night air. An absurd tableau of shattered glass and furniture defying gravity. Then it was gone. I heard in the following silence the heavy tread of his feet, then the meaningless babble of his final words. Away from the window towards the door, stop. A pacing circle, stop. A sudden run, a blazing trail towards the window, towards the open night. I pressed myself against the cool glass, the breath stopped in my lungs, and I saw him go. One leg out, a runner jumping hurdles, wild hair whipping in the breeze, arms wide to the night sky. Free. And like the glass in the chair before, he was gone. No sound announced his impact, he simply vanished. The blooming corpse flower smell surged hotter and brighter than ever, and if I could have scaled the air itself to ascend to the roof above me, I would have clawed through, ground my fingers to the bone. But it was too much, and I broke. Each joint separating, each muscle going slack, I dropped to the floor unconscious before I hit the ground. I woke, how much later I do not know, to the sound of faraway sirens trilling in the air. My body tapped into its final reserves, flooding my limbs with carefully hoarded fire, and I surged to my feet. I didn't have much time. The police, the manager, they would be to his room any moment. I took the stairs 2 at a time and flew down the hallway. He had unlocked the door before his fall, in a final gesture of resignation. I put my hand on the doorknob and sighed in glorious expectation as I pushed the door open. The room was a twin of mine. The occupant, my predecessor, had lived like I had, out of boxes with minimal furniture. Waste and rumpled piles of clothes were strewn across the room. The great hole in the glass window sucked at the air. The sounds of traffic in the world below came to me for the first time in months. The curtains fluttered, whipping like flags of surrender. The call was stronger than ever before, and I closed the door behind me, my eyes vacant and searching. It was here. The siren, the flower, the lure. At first, I could see nothing. But as I walked on uncertain, atrophied feet, I began to, at last, perceive it. As I stepped sideways, it resolved from nothingness, like a sheet of paper seen first from the edge. It was a seam in the world, a tear, a hot, colorless rend across space. Impossibly thin, yet gaping wide, it flared, achingly bright in recognition of my awareness. The cloying smell flooded my nostrils and twined around my ribs. The call was a fire in my pierced forearms, in my veins, and my ecstasy was complete. It seemed to curl and whip, but it never moved. Alien colors and smells flooded from the maw. Somewhere deep in the core of my body, I felt it reach inside and touch me. The wordless beckon of the past months resolved, like a picture snapping into focus, and it spoke to me. I walked towards it, my hands outstretched, weeping with joy. The heat of the thing seemed to reignite every nerve ending in my body. It made me whole, healed me, comforted me, washed over me like the old wave, and I knew I would never want for anything, never fear. I would be loved for all time. It asked precious little in return. I might have stepped into its oceanic arms forever, might have been lost to its promises if something had not awoken in me then. Perhaps my true self emerged, sober at last, lost to the vile chasm's draw so long ago. Perhaps it was only the unthinking, panicked animal we all hold chained in our psyche, the runner, the fighter, Perhaps it was the echo of the occupant, his last act of defiance still rustling in the breeze with the shredded curtains. I do not know. Whatever emerged, it took control of that moment. I saw its lies. I saw it, imprisoned by the sky, calling out. Filthy, reeking promises to those below, those attuned to the foul wavelength of the desire for oblivion. I saw delicate filaments of influence, coils of burning plasma, reaching down to the city below, infecting and cancerous. I saw them wrapping around the lights and hearts of men, choking, crushing, hateful. It was the Borderlands. It was the name to my nameless fear of the dark places in the city and inside me. It was, and it will always be. It would use me, bend me, break me. It already had. When I was done, no more use to it, I would be cast aside and it would call again. I tugged for control of my body, a flesh and bone traitor that still approached this fragment of profane divinity. I pulled harder, and when my vessel cracked free of its grip, I slid back into my skin and allowed the animal instincts to guide my escape. I stopped only long enough to kick twice at the dials of the expensive gas stove with one bare foot. The rotten egg odor of gas began to twirl with the corpse flower smell. An hour later, I would marvel at the blood pooling in my shoe with every footstep as I fled the tower and raced to the edge of the city. But not now. Now I felt nothing. I do not remember descending the stairs. I entered my flat and grabbed a single still-packed duffel bag and my long-abandoned shoes. It called to me from above, furious and reproachful, promising and threatening all at once, and painfully familiar. I could not shut it out, but I held tight to the image of the occupant soaring gracefully through the air, arms forever flailing at the task of being wings, hanging in the night sky. I would leave the tower in my own way, I thought, and this simple promise kept my body my own. I lit my own gas stove before I went, and from a curling strip of a discarded pizza box, I made a small torch which I held to the ragged ceiling. One of the tiny frayed holes, the legacy of my vandal idiocy, began to smolder. I do not remember choosing to do this. I simply did, because it was, unlike everything else in the tower, unlike everything else I had done for half a year, right in some profound way. When I left, it no longer was promising anything but everlasting suffering and pain and submission, yet I still wanted to go to it. Still felt that elemental undertow. At the staircase, I very nearly went up, feeling some awful analog of gravity tugging me skyward. It would have been so easy to go to it, to surrender myself to its magnificent tides, but I hung frozen in the air with my predecessor, saw his final relief and escape, and made my body descend. Out on the sidewalk, a pair of policemen interviewed the manager, jotting notes as the fat man wrung his perfectly groomed hands. He saw me coming, saw me wild-eyed and unkempt, and his piggish eyes narrowed into slits. He thought I'd come now, to claim my spot in the waiting list, to take ownership of the room. He thought me a grotesque monster, a murderer. He opened his mouth to speak, and from above there came a great and terrible roar, a cacophony of cracking glass. A tongue of fire licked the night sky from the gaping hole of the tower's side. Glass began to rain, burning scraps of paper and clothing danced in the night sky. While all eyes were upturned, voices raised in confusion and distress, I turned and slipped away into the night. They want me back in the city to answer questions. I know that any day they will come with a warrant, drag me from my new home to answer for what happened in the tower. I know, of course, that I failed to kill it, that I could never have even truly harmed it. At best, I kept others from it for a short time. Perhaps I kept a single mad and passionate fool from falling into its slick and sweet honey trap. This and my own temporary safety are enough. I also know that even if they never find this cabin, never track down the twisting trail of money that allowed me to flee the city, even if I live to see a natural death, that I can never be free. It has marked me forever. That salivating sweet smell is ever in my nostrils. It never stops speaking, and I will see it in every crumbling barn, in every rusting skeleton of every abandoned car. I saw its writhing tendrils, growing and thickening across the city as I fled, saw them twine across the land in every highway border town. I see them in every dying community I've passed through. It is not quite here yet, in the dark woods, my isolation, my final home, but it will come. It is a corrupting and spreading growth. It isolates, it squeezes, it chokes, it infects. If a lone cell should escape, then the refugee can only carry the contagion with him. It is inside me. Someday, it will have me back. I can only hope in the end that I will fight, that I will not go so willingly, but I know that when it calls me home at last, I will go without question. I will return to a city that has become one immense dead place, one massive, heartless hinterland. I will answer for my small and meaningless act of rebellion, but not today. Today, at the very least, I remain free. Today is enough.
You have been listening to Observable Radio. Tonight's episode, Mapping the Crooked Places, was performed by the Ensemble, featuring Jason Smith. Written by Cameron Suey. Produced by Cameron Suey, Phil Van Hest, Purpurina, and Wendy Hector. Edited by Cameron Suey. Our psychology consultant is Dr. Elisa Leal. Art by Karrin Fletcher. Our theme is The Backrooms, performed by Myuu. Additional music from this episode provided by Amber Glow, Ave Air, Dex 1200, Bill Ferngren, Lennon Hutton, Tim Kulig, Parr, and Rocket Noise. Observable Radio is listener supported. Thanks to all of our patrons and listeners, including Kathleen, John, Tid, Russ, Rick, Kalasin, Brianna, and Zach. Patrons fund the production costs of this show, as well as get access to behind-the-scenes information, extra production material, a discount at the Observable Radio Company store, and an ad-free early release feed of this show, all at patreon.com/observableradio. With the help of our patrons, we've just launched the Observable Radio Company store at observableradio.com/store. There you'll find new stickers, an enamel pin, and our very first t-shirts, on sale and shipping anywhere in the world. We'd be grateful if you stopped by to take a peek. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned.